Welcome once again to the Data Futures Specification Knowledge Share. This is the number 3 of the sessions, and we will be looking at types of year. Today you're going to be presented to by Rachel Wilkes and Ruth Underwood, and I will hand over to Ruth in just a moment.
There we go. Okay, thanks, Matt.
Thank you.
As Matt said, today we're going to be talking about types of year. What we mean by this is the kind of types of activity that a student might undertake. So are they doing an intercalation year, a placement year, a foundation year, and how those different types of activity are recorded. For those of you tuned into previous knowledge shares, we've spoken about the student course session entity within the model, and that's where we record a year of the student's activity. So that's going to be the kind of key part of the model that we'll focus on today, the recording this different types of activity. The plan is then I'll take you through the student course session in terms of what data we collect against a student course session, and then Rachel is going to take you through a number of examples of the different types of activity a student could undertake and how that would be recorded. So, student course session overview then. Again, if you've been in the previous knowledge shares, you'd have seen this kind of slimmed down version of the model. The student course session is the part of the model that links together a few different sections. So the provider gives us information about the courses that they offer, the qualifications that they offer, and they tell us information about the students that are studying with them. The student course session is this central part of the model that links that together. So it says as part of a student's engagement with the provider, the student is studying on this course and doing these modules and at this venue. So it's kind of that central part of the model, linking together the student with the various bits of curriculum that they are engaging with. A few principles of how it's returned. As I've said, it links an engagement to the course that the student is studying on. It is a year long in most cases and records a year of the student's activity. There might be some exceptions where, say, the student leaves early or transfers, where you might see a shorter student course session that's a bit shorter than a year, but they would never be longer than a year. So that's the maximum length would be a year. Within an engagement, you must also not have overlapping student course sessions. So it's those rules around not overlapping and in most cases being a year long means that it's chunking up the student's activity into these year-long periods where we're recording what they're doing and where they're doing it and what they're studying. So what I'll do is just run through the different data items and types of data that we collect against a student course session. Starting off with type of activity, and this is going to be the focus of today's session and a lot of Rachel's scenarios that she'll take you through. So that's things like, are they doing a foundation year, a placement? Are they distance learning? Are they studying abroad? As I mentioned before, maybe they're doing an intercalation year or a bridging course. So the student course session collects what type of activity the student's undertaking. And Rachel will go into more detail in her section of how that is recorded. The next part then, we want to know what type of activity they're doing. We also want information about the intensity of activity. So that's recorded in mode. We want to know if they're studying full-time or part-time. We have a new mode added in for Data Futures of accelerated. So we can also now identify if the student is studying at an accelerated rate. Alongside mode, we also have FTE information, so recording the full-time equivalents for the student within that student course session. We have two different approaches to this within the model. So in England, Northern Ireland and Wales, we're recording FTE by reference period, so 3 reference periods a year, and in every reference period the provider needs to tell us the FTE for that student in that period for a given student course session. In Scotland, it's recorded in a different way. So for each student course session, a provider in Scotland will tell us at the start of that student course session what they're expecting the FTE to be for the session. And at the end, they'll then tell us what it actually was. So it might be that they're expected to do a full-time year. And so at the beginning, it's predicted as 100, but the student leaves early. And so the actual at the end is reduced and lower. So a different approach there for FTE in England, Northern Ireland and Wales by reference period, and Scotland by student course session. Next section then, this is the part of the model where we collect quite a lot of fees and funding information, and I'll run through the headlines of those. So we're interested in the fees that the student is paying. We collect fees within the model at 2 different levels. So providers can record the fee for a student course session, so the fee for a year of the student's course, but they also have the option to record this on a modular basis if that's the way that they charge their fees. So the student course session fee or module fee records the kind of the maximum amount that the student could be charged. So for those of you familiar with the current student return, that's the similar concept to gross fee. So that's the amount that they're being charged before any discounts or waivers or bursaries are taken into account. But we also collect the fee invoice amount. So that's the fee that they're being charged after those waivers and discounts and bursaries are taken into account. So again, if you're familiar with the current collection, that is the same concept as net fee. So we have the gross fee before any discounts on the net fee, what the student is actually paying once those other things have been taken into account. And we also have a HESA ID associated with that fee invoice amount. So that is recording the organisation or the source of the tuition fees. So that might be that the student is paying them themselves. It might be that they're getting the funds from the student loans company or another body. So we're recording the fee they're charged and some information about the source of that fee. We also have an entity in the model that sits with the student course session. It's our funding and monitoring entity. So this contains a number of fields that relate to funding and monitoring. A couple of examples that you're probably familiar with, the ELQ, equivalent or lower qualification, recording if the student's aiming for an equivalent or lower qualification to one that they already hold. This is also where we collect the funding completion field recorded against each student course session. So whether they completed that in accordance with the relevant regulators' rules and definition of completion. Student course session may also have a funding body or bodies, and that is the recording whether the student is eligible for funding by that body. So not necessarily whether they are actually in receipt of funding, it's about their eligibility, whether they're fundable rather than whether they are funded. And therefore the equivalent in our current return, again, is fund code, the fundability code that we collect at the moment about students, whether students are fundable by given bodies. And finally, we have the student financial support that sits against the student course session, recording when they are in receipt of some kind of financial support. And this incorporates a couple of different things that we collect in our current return. So we have the financial support entity at the moment, collected for providers in England, recording the financial support that students receive from their provider. But we also have fields to collect if the student is in receipt of disabled students allowance, and in Wales whether they're in receipt of the part-time fee waiver. So all those different types of financial support now grouped together into the student financial support entity recorded against each relevant student course session.
Ruth, can I just interrupt you? We have a question.
Yeah, of course.
The question is about fee amounts, HESA IDs. Will we be able to see the amount paid by each organisation?
No, we won't be able to. So there will be one HESA ID recorded against each student course session to say the source of those fees. In a previous version of the model, we did have that as a repeating entity. So you could record multiple organisations with the specific amounts. But through our work with reviewing the model over the past year or so, that was identified as not being required through discussions with statutory customers. So we've simplified this part of the model to just record one organisation.
That's great, thank you.
No problem. That is the fees and funding associated with a student course session then. Next section, we also can record the status of a given student course session. And what we mean by this are the following statuses that can be recorded. So you can say if a student moves to dormant status, if they, a postgraduate research student becomes writing up, or if a student goes to intercalate at another provider, then the status of a student course session can be updated to record that. We also have a status of active. We're not requiring providers to say that for every single student course session. Just in most cases, they're returning a student course session, the student is active. It would be required to be returned if, for example, the student became dormant and then restarted study within the same student course session. So the provider could say they went dormant in December and they restarted in March. Using that active status to say they're now back in active study. We're also interested in some information about the student's location. So where are they physically, where are they studying? And there are two different ways that we record this against the student course session, depending upon what they're doing. So if the student is at a venue of the reporting provider or one of its partners, we'd expect to see a study location entity recorded against the student course session that links back to that venue that provider's given us some information about, including a postcode. You can have multiple study locations for a given student course session if the student's time is spent across multiple venues. If the student is not on a venue, we would expect to see that recorded in the off-venue activity entity. So if they were studying abroad or on a placement, that's when we'd see the off-venue activity giving us some information about the type of activity the student's doing and where they are. So that might be, if they're overseas, that would be recorded as a country, so we know which country they're in. Modules are also recorded against the student course session, as I mentioned before. So for every module that a student engages with as part of the student course session, we'd expect to see a module instance entity returned that links to the module information that the provider has submitted. This is now optional for postgraduate research students. We don't require module data for them. And one of the key pieces of guidance around module instances is that they cannot span student course sessions. So I've mentioned a couple of times that student course sessions are recording a year of the student's activity. We also need the associated module instances to be chunked up into those years. So if hypothetically you had 2 student course sessions here, but the student engaged with a module in a period of time that spanned both of those student course sessions. Student course sessions are nice and neatly chunked up into years, so we need the same from the modular information. So we need to slice it down the middle to record that information. So they would have one module instance for the first half and another for the second half, linking to the relevant student course sessions. And in order to be able to see that that's going on, the provider would submit a couple of fields on those 2 module instances. So on the first one, the outcome of that module instance would say that the student is going to continue that module in a subsequent student course session. And for the second module instance, we'd have the continuing module field returned to indicate they're continuing it from a previous student course session. So we'd be able to see that whilst there are 2 separate module instances, they are continuation of the same module. And finally then, we have supervisor allocation information for a student course session. This is the equivalent of the ref data entity in our current student return. So what we're collecting is the ref unit of assessment for postgraduate research students and the UKPRN of the supervising organisation, and with appropriate proportions. So we can see here whether there is collaborative provision if more than one organisation is supervising a PGR student, and we can also see the relevant unit of assessments for that student course session. So that then is your overview of the student course session and the data that we collect at that level. I can pause now for questions before I hand over to Rachel, if there are any.
Yeah, I've got one for you, Ruth. What are the expectations for recording a student as dormant? Does this require a formal suspension of studies, or should it also be used when a student is found to be inactive? And then will the guidance set this out?
So I think it would need to be recorded if the student was inactive, even if there wasn't a formal suspension of studies. So I think that would be a case where the student hasn't attended, potentially, even if they haven't formally agreed a suspension in studies. I think what we'd expect to see, we'd have some continuity validation between reference periods. So if a student was active in reference period 1 and disappeared in reference period 2, we'd need the provider to actively declare why. So if the student wasn't active, they would need to declare them as dormant. I'm not sure exactly what we've got in the guidance on that at the moment, but I can double check and we can make sure that that is covered in there.